Hello, everyone. I have a question here from a viewer, a reader, whatever. He says, I studied with Jehovah's Witnesses for many years, off and on, went to many meetings, but never got baptized, as I just couldn't trust the governing body and elders with their power and control. I never did see true Christian love either. Once I realized the religion is now corrupt with sexual abuse, the UN affiliation, money investments, and much more, I left and now serve Jehovah as an individual out in the wilderness. My question to you is, how can I get baptized outside the organization that Jehovah and Jesus approve of, as there isn't much info on this? Isn't this a very important part of serving Jehovah? Am I on the right track to gain Jehovah's love and approval, being on my own and in the wilderness? Well, I think you have a lot of company out in the wilderness there. That is a dilemma, a situation that more and more people are finding themselves in. You know, with the internet, I think a lot of people, the Jehovah's Witnesses contact them at the door or whatever, and they begin to study, and sooner or later they're going to get on the internet and they, find out all this stuff that's going on, and a growing number of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who all have their horror stories about abuse, and not minimizing it at all. I mean, there have been some horrible things that have gone on in congregations of Jehovah's Witnesses, and a lot of injuries out there. As far as being baptized, I've had others ask me before if I would baptize them, and my answer is always no. For one thing, I don't think there's an alternative, really, because it would imply that the baptisms of all of Jehovah's Witnesses are somehow invalid because of all this negativity that you mentioned, or the fact that for the last 30 years or so, the Watchtower has changed the baptismal vows to include itself. Do you recognize that your baptism brings you into association with Jehovah's Spirit-directed organization, or something like that? That would mean that, for instance, my baptism is not valid. I was baptized before those vows, but I don't think it works that way. We should really ask ourselves, what is God's will? Because that's really, the determining factor. In the 7th chapter, where Jesus was speaking about the two roads, the broad and spacious road leading off to destruction, and many are on it, and then there's the narrow road leading off to life, and few are on it. And Jesus went on to say that many people will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name and expel demons in your name and do many powerful works in your name? And Jesus said, he will say to them, get away from me. I never knew you, you workers of lawlessness. But then Jesus said that not everyone saying to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, but the one doing the will of my Father will. So, how do we do the will of God? What is God's will? Well, all Christians, it is God's will that all Christians be preachers and teachers. I mean, the last thing Jesus said to his disciples, go therefore, making disciples of people of all the nations, teaching them So when Jehovah's Witnesses study with someone and invite them to the Kingdom Hall, the end goal is not baptism necessarily, is that we become preachers and teachers. The goal of every preacher and teacher is to replicate themselves. That's what Jesus did. So that when he left, there were men and women to carry on the work that he started. And that's, the work that the Watchtower sponsors. They provide the platform, you might say, that they equip Jehovah's Witnesses to be competent preachers and teachers. They provide the equipment, the territory, the motivation, the training, everything. There's no way you can go off and replicate them. Well, let's say that, okay, you get baptized. Is that the end of it? What if you were to follow Jesus' command to preach and teach, and let's say you make a disciple, or you find someone that's interested, where are you going to direct them? What if they want to get baptized? Are you going to baptize them? That would be like starting your own religion, right? I mean, there's like 38,000 denominations and sects in the world. I don't think we need one more. So, your comment that, you don't trust the governing body or the elders, it's really not necessary that you do. Trusting God and Jesus is what is expected of us. And take the example of in the first century, there were Jesus' disciples, and then there were the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders. And as you know, they persecuted Jesus, and they tried to trip him up at every opportunity. But Jesus probably shocked his followers. If you read there in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, he said, the Pharisees have seated themselves in the seat of Moses. Therefore, whatever they tell you, do it. Only not with their hypocrisy. Because they say, but they do not do. They bind up heavy loads on men, but they will not budge it with their finger. And then Jesus went on, he really tore into them, didn't he? Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! But the point I want to make is, Jesus said, whatever they tell you, do it. Well, I might add that was only a temporary arrangement, because after Jesus died, the Pharisees, and more particularly the chief priest and the Sanhedrin, ordered the apostles to stop preaching, and they said, no, we're not going to obey you, we're going to obey God as ruler rather than men. But it is interesting, before Jesus died, and it was shortly before he died, that he said, whatever they tell you, do it. So it was God's will for them to be subject in relative subjection to the religious authorities at that time. Things would change in time, but it was God's will for them. So even if the governing body are, their motives may be questionable, and they've committed the organization to what amounts to apostasy with their partnership with the United Nations. That was a long time ago, basically, and most of the governing body that were part of that, they've died off. There's a fresh crop. I'm not saying that they are innocent or whatever, but it's not for us to judge, is it? that Jesus is going to be the judge. And I think, that is something that Jehovah's Witnesses do not appreciate. For one reason, the Watchtower doesn't teach that. They teach that Christ came in 1914 and the house of God was inspected in 1918 and Jesus gave him, thumbs up. But all of that's nonsense, basically. The coming of Christ is in the future. Take, for example, what Jesus' half-brother wrote in his letter, the letter of James. He says, "Not many of you, brothers, should be teachers, knowing that we will receive a heavier judgment." Was that judgment imposed in 1919? That doesn't make any sense. So there is an accounting. Just as Jesus mentioned in the 12th chapter of Luke, about when he was discussing the faithful, who really is the faithful and discreet slave. And he said the slave that does not do his master's will, out of ignorance, he will be beaten with a few strokes. The one that knew his master's will and did not do in line, he'll be beaten with many. And then Jesus expressed a principle that to the one who has been given much, much will be demanded of him. And the one whom people put in charge, more than usual, will be demanded of him. So there is an accounting. Those with responsibilities are more responsible. And I believe that accounting day is rapidly approaching. So being out in the wilderness doesn't necessarily give us an advantage. If Christ is coming to inspect his congregation and we're not part of that, that doesn't put us in a good spot, does it? I mean, we really have to appreciate that God deals with a people. It was a nation of Israel. With the coming of Christ, there are congregations. For example, in the 18th chapter of Matthew, even though the congregation has not been formed at that point, Jesus was giving instructions on how to deal with problems among brothers. And it's kind of a three-step process. He said, if your brothers offend you, go to him in private, see if you can sort it out. And if that doesn't work, take along 2 or 3 others. And if that doesn't work, go to the congregation. The congregation. And as I say, a congregation didn't exist when Jesus uttered those words. Of course, he knew it was coming. All of Paul's letters, well, not all. He wrote a letter to Philemon and 2 to Timothy and 1 to Titus, but all the rest were addressed to congregations, to the Galatians, to the Ephesians, to the Philippians, the Colossians, Corinthians, so on. Congregations. In Jesus' letters to the 7 symbolic congregations of Smyrna and Ephesus and so on, Thyatira, he deals with congregations. And those congregations that he wrote to had some serious problems. They had a problem of immorality, of idolatry. And Jesus said he's given them time to repent, but if they do not, then they'll come under his harsh judgment. He'll war with them with the sword of his mouth. But Jesus doesn't expect us to abandon the congregation because there are problems. There were problems in the first century. I mean, his second letter, John wrote about this character called Diotrephes. He said he likes to have the first place in the congregation. He doesn't accept anything from us with respect, and those who try to accept us, he tries to hinder them and throw them out of the congregation. Can you imagine that? If you accept the aged apostle John and treat him with respect, you might be persecuted by this presiding elder. I mean, like I say, there have been some outrageous things. I receive emails from people, I've witnessed them myself and experienced them myself. Those problems are unfortunate, but God allows it. And again, what's the question? What is God's will? Does he expect us to just simply go off or rather find a way to endure and deal with unpleasant situations? I think you know the answer to that. I know that obviously there are a lot of people that are in situations that they're disfellowshipped and whatnot where it's not really possible to go forward, but I think for people that are studying, it's better to stick with a congregation for encouragement, for support. Otherwise, I've seen too many people just, you're going to go off back to your old lifestyle. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of the matter. Because we all have our own motives, don't we? Jeremiah said, the heart is desperate and treacherous. Who can know it? So maybe examine your own self. You said you studied with Jehovah's Witnesses for a long time, off and on, went to a lot of meetings, and that was before you found out about all the negative stuff. So what was holding you back originally? That's something for self-examination. Do you remember Jesus' illustration of the sower and the seed in the 13th chapter of Matthew? He said a sower went forth, and some of the seed fell on the roadside, and the birds came and ate it, and some of it fell on the rocky soil, sprouted, but then it withered, and on and on. Jesus went on to talk about the seed that was sown among the thorns, and the bramble grew up and it choked out the plant. Well, he went on to explain that the anxieties of life and the deceptive power of riches, and in Mark's account of it in the 4th chapter, he said, and the desires for all the other things can choke out the word and you become unproductive. God's will is that we be productive, like Jesus said, but the fine seed fell on fine soil and it produced 30, 60, and 100-fold. Again, it's God's will that we preach and teach others. So could it be that maybe your heart was distracted with the desire for other things, and so it was convenient to say, well, the congregation was unloving, I don't trust them, and now, you have a good excuse. The Watchtower is off into all this stuff. They buy military stocks, and so there you go. You're off the hook, so to speak. Maybe in your own heart, you didn't want to go out knocking on doors. It's a lot of people. That's a big stumbling block for a lot of people. Maybe there's something else. I don't know. That's why I say we each have to examine our own motive. But I think if you want to get baptized, you well know that the Watchtower would not consent to baptize you if you were not qualified. And to be qualified, you have to show some initiative to be a preacher and teacher, because that's what's expected of us by Christ. when Jesus was baptized, he immediately went off and started his ministry after he came back from 40-day wilderness experience. I say he was in the wilderness too, but he came back. No, but that's the whole point of being an unbaptized publisher. It's the Watchtower kind of puts the training wheels on your bike and gets you going, and you get going out in the ministry and develop a love and at least some expectation of what to expect, of what's expected of us. And then you take the training wheels off and So you may not like my response here, but that's it. Thanks for watching.